for the step you've taken so far in understanding self and also eventually understanding others. And remember, we were noting down what losses have you gone through. Go back from when you were a child up to the age that you are. Look back and see, what did I experience? I also was able to ask, was it a visible loss? And was it an invisible loss? Was it either? And remember, with all these losses, there are emotions attached to it. Note them down. And so now, when loss happens, we step into bereavement. This is the period after a loss where grieving begins. And so, what is grieving? Grieving is reaction to the loss. We react differently to losses. For some of us, it is so behavioral that you're able to see extremes of behavior, both adaptive, both maladaptive. And with grief, we have different kinds of grief. As I highlight them, I would like to ask you, is there any grief that you will resonate with? And so we have what we call normal grief. Normal grief is when you're able to continue with the reaction and start processing the loss and what is happening. Remember, grief is so unique and individual to a person. Why? It depends on the attachment you had with that particular person or that particular object or that which you lost. So we have normal grief where one is able to immediately start, accepting and being aware of the emotions that are coming and being aware of this is how life is changing because I do not have this person, I do not have this anymore. So that is normal grief. We have anticipatory grief where you are aware that I'm about to lose this particular person, I'm about to probably lose this particular, thing. For example, if you're about to retire and I would be retiring in the month of July and maybe you're in January of the year, you already have that feeling that I know I no longer will be experiencing, the workplace. Maybe people say that when someone is unwell, for others that they knew that this person perhaps would not make it. And so there's that anticipatory grief that I know this person may no longer be there. So that's anticipatory grief. Then we have disenfranchised grief. This is grief that on quote unquote normal occasions, society or those people around you may not term it as something that should be grieved. Perhaps it could be a relationship that's not recognized by society. It perhaps could be an aspect that society says, this is normal, move on, or this happens, move on. But to that individual person, this loss is very significant. To that individual person, the attachment that they had with that which they have lost was great compared to the people around them. So we call that disenfranchised grief. And we realize that grief can become complicated. It's recorded that this is grief that for adults takes more than a year, for children more than 6 months. And again, grief is so personal. How you grieve, how I grieve is very different. And so we need to be more compassionate. We need to be more empathetic when we see individuals go through losses. Let us understand that their grieving will be different. So when we have complicated grief, we have grief that sometimes is hidden, is not noticeable, or perhaps grief that you were not able to go through because it was short. Maybe there are multiple losses. By the time you're processing this loss, another loss has happened. And so there's a series of losses. So you have grief happening in short, I would say, short spasms of grief. And then we have sudden grief. You didn't see it coming and you have experienced loss suddenly. It can lead to complicated grief. It's also important to note that our grieving can be affected by various aspects. It can be affected by various, you know, things. For example, if perhaps in the case of someone dying, there was no body, you did not receive a corpse, maybe the death was violent, perhaps the death happened suddenly and in an area where you could not be able to maybe go and have your final rites or mourn this person or mourn this thing the way you would have wanted to mourn it. Perhaps you have um, a missing person situation where there is no corpse to be buried. You don't know whether this other person is dead. And there is also, for example, when you may have had unresolved issues with this person. Those are just some of aspects that can affect grieving. And also culture. Culture can affect grieving. Your culture, perhaps your socialization allows you to grieve differently, or maybe does not allow you to grieve fully. Those are some of the aspects that can affect grieving. So I'd like to ask again, as we journey in this awareness of self, what grief do you resonate with? What grief did you go through? What grief are you still going through? Or have you grieved what you have lost?